Evet, teşekkürler. Önemli konular var.
And to address those and to bring things a bit closer to a people-centered perspective, we're going to now start perhaps the less formal part of the Istanbul dialogues. We'll be discussing in a Davos-style format the issues that have already been raised, but perhaps getting at them in a different way. We have a mix of intergovernmental, civil society, private sector, and development bank narratives coming. And what we would like to do is challenge all of us, including you, because we'll leave some time, a little bit of time for questions, answers, and comments, for a little bit of criticism, constructive criticism, maybe, of what we've heard so far this morning, questioning of assumptions, explicit or implicit, underlying some of the narrative we've heard, identification of missing issues, missing topics that we may not have covered, and if indeed there are elephants in the room that we're tiptoeing around but are afraid to actually call by name, maybe we could call those out as well. So I'm pleased to take on this part of the dialogues, that I'm joined by a very strong panel. Please allow me to introduce them. We're very pleased that on my immediate left we have Ms. Majlinda Bregu, the Secretary General of the Regional Cooperation Council and a specialist on financing European integration in the Western Balkans, speaking with us, and continuing the multi-year tradition of having the Secretary General of the Regional Cooperation Council speaking at the Istanbul Development Dialogues. We also have Mr. Robert Schoellhammer, the Asian Development Bank's representative in Europe. He's also worked on development finance in North America, so brings a wide variety of geographic and financial expertise to bear in our discussions. To my immediate right is Mr. Gonzalez, former Deputy Minister of Finance and General Manager of the Central Bank of Costa Rica, with a also very strong background in financial markets and especially investments in energy and environmental sustainability. And last but hardly least, we have Neeti Biyani, who works in the Center for Budget and Government Accountability in New Delhi and is a specialist on issues of tax justice, illicit financial flows, and transparency in the global financial system. So welcome, panelists. I'm very much interested in hearing what we have to say on these topics. And I would like to ask our panelists, first of all, for very quick, short reactions to what you've heard so far from the government officials, from the keynote speakers, keeping in mind that we want to go a little bit beyond maybe what's been said before. And I would like to first ask Neeti Biyani to start us off in this vein. Neeti, the floor is yours. 2 or 3 minutes, please.
Thanks, Ben. I'd just like to talk about how the SDGs were originally envisioned as being oriented towards securing human rights for everyone. Something that I haven't heard this morning and before lunch today. They were also envisioned for ending poverty and ensuring peace and prosperity for everybody. The financing for development process then remains crucial to the achievement of the SDGs. But 4 years later, here we are in 2019, and the world remains completely off track in its ambition to realize the 2030 agenda. The process has so far not been pivotal in removing many structural barriers to socio-economic transformation and advancing systemic reform of global economic frameworks to realign them with the imperatives of human rights, gender justice, development justice, and therefore sustainable development. There is a fundamental context that we're missing here then. The systemic issues that we see are the result of rapid and sometimes frenzied financialization of economies that has allowed the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. I'm concerned that the main focus of the FFT process then is on using public funds to leverage and de-risk private investment without recognizing the wave of debt crisis that the world is facing today. The narrative continues to be about incentivizing big business and corporations instead of addressing large-scale tax abuse that is often carried out by these same corporations. Then, there is an obvious nexus between state and business. This is also in a context where ODA, official development assistance, continues to decline. The implementation focus of the SDGs too is shifting to the national level without any progress on an enabling global environment which will allow developing countries to preserve the national fiscal and policy space that they have. In this context, let me just very briefly touch upon 3 areas that I'd like to draw your attention to within the FFD framework that need our immediate attention. The first is the architecture of the international financial system. We see that financial, accounting, and tax norms today are being set by a bunch of related and very, very coordinated technocratic bodies, which include your Bretton Woods institutions, OECD, G20, FATF, etc. These bodies have funding agreements and reciprocal membership, but are only limited to having northern countries, mostly northern countries, as their members, and are even headquartered in the global north. There is a democratic deficit in the architecture and the functioning of these bodies and the constituencies that they represent. Developing countries have really no voice in setting the global agenda. And the second is ODA, which has been dropping from $153 billion in 2017 to $149 billion in 2018, which is a decline of 2.7%, and in Africa, we've seen a decline of 4%. How is this not leaving everyone behind? As a portion of GNI, ODA across all DAC donors sits at 0.31%, which is well below the 0.7% target agreed by the UN. The ambition enshrined in the SDGs then is not being matched by the actions of governments, especially in the global north. The glaring lack of ambition on part of donors to contribute to financing the SDGs coincides with an optimistic assumption that private finance will make up for the shortfalls to finance the SDGs. While donors and institutions may be promoting a billions to trillions approach with a narrative on innovative forms of funding, such as blended finance, these are not well suited to reach the furthest behind. And the third, very quickly, is a wave of debt crisis that we're facing, something that's been alluded to this morning as well. Debt crisis risks have been increasing rapidly, and service costs have risen, which have increasingly crowded out spending for sustainable development. There has been very little focus on issues of debt on part of the international community, and it is only this year that we see a commitment in the FFD statement to work towards global responsible lending and borrowing. I'll conclude my remarks for now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Neeti. Excellent points reminding us that issues of human rights, justice, and democratic deficits should not be taken too far away from financing sustainable development. Roy Gonzalez, the floor is yours. What is your reaction to what you've heard so far?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts with the audience. I must say that I really enjoyed the presentation, the first presentation of the UNDP administrator, and the perspective of the SDG as a global risk map for the future, as well as the necessity to have the right public policy environment in order to achieve better results on the 2030 agenda. I also find very interesting the mention of Luis Felipe Lopez Calva about he mentioned that the SDGs are a challenge in every country, and this is important because sometimes people tend to believe that the 2030 agenda is a concession for the less developed or poor countries, and this is not the question. Mr. Akbal, the Chief of Strategy and Budget of the Presidency of the Republic of Turkey, made a good presentation, but I'm not sure that I can fully agree with the idea he mentioned that the SDG may impose a short-term cost, but are very important for the long-term investment climate. I am more close to the idea that the SDG are part of a strategy for long-term survival in this planet. I come from Costa Rica, and Costa Rica is, as you know, a country where biodiversity is very important, not only because we are the custodians of 6.5% of the total biodiversity of this planet, but also because ecotourism is a very important sector of our economy, accounted for more than 8% of the Costa Rican economy and very close to 10% of the total employment of the country. And in this sense, I was worried about the report on biodiversity and ecosystem services assessment. It was presented 3 weeks ago, and it has some alerts, such one as mentions that 75% of global food crop type relied on animal pollination at this time, and because of the loss of pollinators, it is estimated that the annual cost of this could be up to 500 billions. So I think that it is necessary that we understand that the SDG agenda is not a short-term cost. It's a matter of survival, and this is something that we cannot wait to progress. In that sense, the presentation from the deputy ministers, Ms. Sorensen, for example, the deputy minister of economy of Albania, it was very interesting and also positive to see that 61% of the budget they are expecting to contribute to SDGs. It was interesting because it's basically the same number in the case of Kazakhstan, and not very different of the Moldova and Uzbekistan, but at least I think we're making some progress in terms of the alignment of the public budgets with the SDGs. I particularly find interesting the presentation of the Deputy Minister of Finance of Uzbekistan, who mentions that they have 125 targets for the 16 because they don't have it's completely understandable, and this is interesting because one experience that I have when I was the Deputy Minister of Finance in Costa Rica is that the public budgets are usually, they don't have so many targets, so it is a very interesting presentation also, and I think that we're going on the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for reminding us that the SDGs are not only a strategy for long-term survival, one might also say they're an opportunity for those companies, those countries like Costa Rica that are able to take advantage of the potential economic benefits by investing in tourism, ecotourism, to promote prosperity and sustainable growth and sustainable development in this respect. I'd like to now turn the floor to Majlinda Bregu of the Regional Cooperation Council and ask how these issues look to you from the perspective of an organization that has been promoting economic development and social development as part of a peace-building and post-war reconciliation agenda in the Western Balkans.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'll try to pull no punches and try to be as brief as I can. First and foremost, I would like to use the opportunity to congratulate that sustainable victory of the pro-European forces in the last election to EU Parliament. And on the region, that one speaks a lot. For the region and Western Balkans to move forward, definitely we would really need people with a high vision, a durable one, and not only short-term policies. Said that, a lot has changed in the Western Balkans, a lot has changed in the whole Southeast Europe during the last years. The trends are quite positive, so everybody who will go and have a look at the World Bank data or the surveys that have been released or produced lately. We'll notice that the region is moving and is projected to solidify its upward trend, reaching at 3.5% of growth in 2019 and 3.8% in 2020. Still, there is a question in there. So if all these changes that have transformed the region lately are long-lasting ones, are those based, let's say, and shaped on long-term vision or only based on the electoral cycles? And this is something that whenever you speak of Balkans, when the process of European membership and then aligning EU accession with SDGs, both of those have to come to an understanding that these are transformative processes that the region needs to move forward. Then I was thinking while listening to the panel of ministers, the whole region has been involved lately during the last 3 years in building up kind of a model of the single market of the EU, which is called the Regional Economic Area. But if one would go back again and then check out of those pillars of the Regional Economic Area, and out of those 110 actions to ensure the Regional Economic Area, you will notice that the social dimension is almost missing in there. And it's only one action focusing on digital upskilling of women and youth who you might find as plausible in terms of social dimension of the Regional Economic Area, which I think it's going to be quite a good start for us all, governments of the region, and representatives of different institutions as well, to develop policies that really needs to closely align the European pillar of social rights with SDGs. And as I said, to sum it up, so that is a challenge that we need to think upon very, very carefully. The whole SDGs, it's not a list of ticking boxes, as the process of European accession as well should not be a list of ticking boxes, but mostly, and not even a process of dates anymore, but mostly an issue of transforming the region to a sustainable, developed one. And on that one, I think that a lot is still and still has to be developed and to happen. So I'll stop here for the first part, and then I think that will be more concrete in the second term.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for calling attention especially to the challenges of aligning the SDGs with the EU accession, EU integration agenda, which is so important not only in the Western Balkans, but also in the countries of the Eastern Partnership that are pursuing a similar agenda. And the UN development system has worked very hard to help bring these two agendas together in ways that are useful for the governments in question. So, Robert, if I may, how do these issues look to you? What are your conclusions from what you've heard initially?
Well, thank you very much, Ben. It's, from maybe just for those who don't know us, I'm from the Asian Development Bank, and we work, as the name suggests, in about I think it's 43 countries across the Asia-Pacific region, starting in the Caucasus to the left, all the way to Pacific Islands on the right, and most countries in between. So, you know, over the last few decades, we've seen phenomenal growth in the region. You know, 2 of the world's 3 largest economies are now in Asia, but this challenge of sustainable development is utterly enormous. I think my main takeaway from this morning particularly was, again, just on, I think, the scale of the financing needs. I think this is borne out by IDD's own research. We have a figure, which is, I think, $1.7 trillion worth of infrastructure every year just to keep more or less on track with the SDGs. And when I talk about infrastructure, it's transport, but it's water, sanitation, sewerage. It's really essential things for human health, on top of, and also the infrastructure you need to effectively combat climate change. So I think being reminded of just how much money is needed, I think, is one key aspect there. Now, the second point I took from this morning is that there's more money than ever before. And I would agree with this. Just before this session, we were talking with colleagues about Mongolia, where I used to be the country director. There was a mining boom. There was the first ever bond that this country floated a few years ago. It was 10 times oversubscribed. So a country which sold $1.5 billion worth of bonds from its own development bank had $15 billion worth of demand, you might say. So, I mean, even this is in a country which had a GDP of $400 a head just 20 years ago. So, yes, there's a lot of money chasing some sort of investment. So, why doesn't it happen? I think this lovely quote this morning that from UNDP Administrator was that countries are not on the highway of global finance. It's such a lovely visual description, and it's quite true. I've recently taken up this job as ADB rep to Europe, where the perception tends to be that Asia is fine relative to other regions, but again, Asia presents a very differentiated picture. China is one thing, Afghanistan quite another. China is also very differentiated. So I think one needs to look at where you actually have those particular investment needs. Again, we have many countries which are able to access finance. I spent 9 years in the Philippines over the last few decades. So parts of the Philippines do spectacularly well in getting infrastructure investment. Others are completely left off. So you've also got that geographical difference there. So yes, there's money out there, but it does tend to be incredibly patchy. Just very recently also, I met with a very big European bank, and they were interested to put private money into projects, ADB projects in Asia Pacific. There's a reason we have our base in Frankfurt. But they said, we're only interested in China and India. And I tried to say, what about Indonesia, Philippines, what about Kazakhstan, Mongolia, etc.? No, China and India. Our credit risk departments won't allow us to go anywhere else. So the risk is something which, again, was very rightly brought out this morning, that there's this wall of risk which prevents these essential investments from coming through, and I think that was very correctly underscored. So I think from the ADB's point of view is, how do you, first of all, let's take our $1.7 trillion, and that's just for the Asia-Pacific region. There's no way in the world you can put every development bank, in the world together. You can put governments, mobilize domestic revenues. It's not going to be enough. Whatever one's ideology, you need the private sector. The question is, what sort of private sector is it? Is it a responsible private sector? Is it small and medium enterprises? These are the way the questions have to go. But the reality, putting meat into the substance of this billions to trillions debate it does depend on the alliance with the private sector. Of course, easier said than done, and this is one of the aspects which I think we look forward to discussing more in the panel. I'll just come to, I think, one very, very, very extremely important point raised earlier is the question of debt. Finance, of course, is, when I joined the Asian Development Bank 1,000 years ago, most of what we did was grants. That's quite easy, there's not that risk. Now it's debt, very often foreign currency debt. So you have taxpayers in Kyrgyzstan, for example, who are paying back dollar, euro, yen denominated debt. You've got to be very careful with the type of investments you put in if you're working with debt and foreign currencies. So my last point on this one, and I think was raised this morning as well, was just the quality. You need quality investment. It's not, money itself can actually be a problem when you have too much of it. It can lead to overheating, and various other sort of negative outcomes. So yes, you need to raise money. The money also has to be it has to be cheap. So you don't, as cheap as possible, so you don't put countries or provinces or whatever into debt. And it has to be high quality. And we all know, I think anybody who's worked in developed or developing countries will know that white elephants can readily happen. So things need to be well designed. They need to be designed with social impact in mind. So there's a lot of vectors to bring together. And I think that's very much the role of the international system. UN, very much, of course, I think the multilateral banks, making sure that all this happens in a good coordinated fashion, but at scale. And for that, the last point I would make is that the private sector is utterly essential. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, these are, I think, an excellent set of initial comments that tie together much of what we heard this morning. But let me go maybe a little bit further in detail and building on some of the things that you just said. On the one hand, indeed, there's more money than ever before, but it's not going to the places that arguably need it the most. And there's various explanations for this, the wall of risk, the countries are far from the highway of global finance, the problems of foreign currency debt, which are issues in Turkey as well, by the way, we might add. And then the point of what sort of private sector are we talking about? to me, this gets back to, I think, a fundamental question. When we talk about the financing gaps, so many trillions are needed at any given time, are we really talking about that there's not enough finance? Or is the problem that we have the wrong kind of finance and the wrong kind of instruments and the wrong kinds of institutions to make finance go where arguably it's needed most, and to have finance serve sustainable development rather than the other way around? And if it's really a question of not the right kind of finance, then what changes, what reforms should be made to the global financial system, the global development system, to address this, to have the right kind of finance? It's a provocative question, but perhaps it's worth briefly considering. Robert, if I may, I'd like to ask you to be the first to respond to this.
Well, if you look at coming from a development bank, and I've spent most of my career in development banks at the first at the African, then the Asian Development Bank. We've actually seen a mushrooming of development banks of late. So there's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, there's a new development bank. One thing I found on coming back to Europe after many years is this plethora, this really, again, bilateral development finance institutions being created by almost every single European country, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, by Belgium, etc., etc. So I think what we're seeing is a response by governments, who I think, and very much, I think, to various degrees, being driven by the SDGs, in using public finance to try leverage. So I actually don't think you need massive changes to the international financial system, because at the moment you've got funds for pretty much everything. Climate funds, you've got the Multilateral Development Bank Collective, the climate investment funds, you've got the Green Climate Fund, you've got global funds for HIV, AIDS, etc. There's pretty much a fund for everything out there. So we've got more development banks, and in addition we've got the German KfW, you've got, you name it, you've got it. I wouldn't know what to, I spend half of my time in the strategy department in ADB, and if somebody gave me a task, what new would you invent? I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know, because between the UN, the World Bank Group, etc., there's pretty much a financial solution for everything out there, any need out there. Within the banks, and I think I'm talking about this one tomorrow, the emphasis is on innovation, on ever greater leverage. So this is part of the natural progression of the development finance system. But ultimately, I guess the point of all this is that the finance itself is not the answer. Money, is it different finance, more finance? Probably both. I think you need more finance, you need different finance but of the type I just spoke about. You need finance which goes to Afghanistan. Major investments, transformational investments. And again, this is my experience now of living in Frankfurt. When we approach institutional investors, I had lunch with the head of the Swiss pension fund, and quite rightly he says, I'm managing people's pensions. It's we have to be very responsible. If as somebody who can retire not too far from here, I want to be very sure that whoever manages my pension isn't going to squander it on some insane ADB project somewhere. So you also need, again, that quality. And I think that's also where all of these players, whether it's the international institutions, the private sector, the government, need to be talking a common language based around common goals. And I think that's where the SDGs have been extremely helpful. Again, I'm quite new to Europe again, but I was so impressed when I went to Denmark. And you saw that a very strong commitment by the Danish government, really, and giving incentives to their businesses to put money to invest in SDG-related investments. Again, asking them, there's a moral imperative, but also helping them to do so, giving them financial incentives. So I think one very key elemental need, it's not to reinvent the financial system, but again, have people talking a common language. Get the shareholders in places like ADB to push for initiatives which create good projects. Because ultimately, as somebody who's worked in development finance a long time, the biggest need, it's not, the finance is generally there somewhere, but you need a good project to invest it in. You can find projects, but are they going to be good? No, we're going to be back to the debt problem. So coalition, common goal, and And I think the system can accommodate most things as it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Let me now pass the floor to Majlinda and ask you, does the West Balkans need more finance, different finance, or both? And if it's different, how should it be different?
Well, I tend to believe that it needs better finance, more finance, and a new system and a new perspective of rethinking those key elements that should be in place in there. And I will tell you why and give you some figures. Well, I mentioned earlier the regional economic area that was created 3 years ago. And I said that out of those 110 measures, only one of those, it's having the social dimension. That speaks a lot, not on better finance needed or more money needed, but it speaks a lot on the perspective needed in the region. And in terms of money, I would say that when it goes to the Western Balkans, money is never enough in there. You all know that it's an area that came out from the war that is underdeveloped. Infrastructure is still in need for a lot of funds. But on the other hand, what we are trying to analyze lately is that how the human capital is approaching and is in line with whatever the development the region is needing. And I will give you some interesting figures that might speak a little bit and contradict your question. In terms of education in the region, money, it has been invested there for 10 years, but there has always been a mismatch from the real needs on the current situation, and based on a reality check, that's how we see it nowadays. So needs are of 280 million euros investments in education, while actually the investments in 10 years have only been 13 million euros. Now you'll make the maths and calculation yourself. Then the whole Western Balkans are not a big market, so all in all together we are 18 million, which speaks a lot on the need of building up financial markets and having common regional policies. Otherwise we are not going to be attractive as other regions in the world are. Then there is a whole mismatch in the region in terms of the need that the labor market is asking for. From the education up to the training and then to the labor market, you'll see that there is a huge difference. And based on the latest data that we have from our survey, which is the Balkan Barometer, if you are going to ask the people in the region, those that do have a business or a corporate or are CEOs, if there is anything that they would like to change and in order to have more people from the region into their companies and to employ more people, they will say that they have mostly 40% of them, they say that they have difficulties in identifying and in closing job vacancies because a diploma is there, but skills are missing. Talent is everywhere in the region, but skills are those that still has to be enhanced. And there is another disparity that speaks a lot on how the human capital from one side and the economic development are not usually bridged with each other. Back again to this Balkan Barometer. We measure two components. So we have a public opinion survey and we have a business survey. And you'll see that there is such a huge gap in between two. If one will only read the first part, that the public opinion survey of the Balkan Barometer, Western Balkans will look as the most depressive area in the world. But if somebody else is going to read only the business perception, it's going to have another picture, that the Western Balkans are the most optimistic area in the world. So those data speak that bridge and that linkage between the human capital, explaining to people, trying to involve them as well in building up the region. It's not going in the same line with the business perspective. And I think that this is quite interesting. In terms of investment, you know that the social sector is usually financed by public fundings. But if you are going to ask to any, let's say, European institution or instruments, if there are challenges mostly in financing economic projects or infrastructure, building highways, bridges, and so on, or something on the human capital, it's going to be much easier, the first one for them. And that it means that the financial market actors perceive the social projects as being riskier and not quite attractive, or let's say unattractive. That is another challenge that, the region has to face when it comes in terms of social investments, and that might impact definitely in the long-term horizon the good development and changing its perspective. And I will just tell you one more figure that is quite worrisome in the region, and we've been discussing it really, let's say, largely with UNDP. It's again on the human capital. There are a lot of disparities in terms of the human capital in the region, but one worrisome data is that 5.7 million of people abandoned the region, which is 1/3 of the Western Balkans population, in the last 5 years. And that is really something, and a figure that is shocking. So if we are not going to find whatever the real problems are in there, and that's why I said at the very start that I'll pull no punches in there. This is not a situation for trying to discuss or going through a brainstorming what's going to work and what's going to change the situation and the reality in there. This is a situation that is a call and a bell that is ringing for real change. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's always good when we discuss the Western Balkans when we can combine the common pessimism about massive immigration and other things with some optimistic notes, such as about improvements in the business climate. Yeah. And indeed, in so many countries now we see growing progress in integration into regional and global value chains, the strengthening export-driven growth, and there are indeed, when we look on the commercial side, some good news. Let me now turn the floor to Roy Gonzalez and ask you, if I may, Costa Rica, Central America, Latin America as a whole, if I may, do these regions need more finance or different finance? And not only from the perspective of the macro, but in terms of how investments in sustainability actually work at the company level, a company that wants to attract money for a green bond or some kind of innovative financial instrument. Are the rules really in place for this, and what needs to be done to make the vision of green growth and green investments more a reality?
Okay. Yes, I think this morning the Assistant Secretary of the UN mentioned that we need more but smarter finance. And I think that's true. Over the last decade, if you look at the figures, because of the financial crisis at the beginning of 2008 and the quantitative easing and the monetary policies, the government debts have increased by almost 30 trillion between 2008 and 2018. In the case of Costa Rica, the government debt has also increased substantially, and one interesting thing is, well, as probably many of you already know, in 1949, Costa Rica made the abolition of the military, so that allows us to invest a lot of money in education. And in 1997, we basically increased the budget allocated to education to 6% of GDP, and in 2011 to 8% of GDP. However, education is very important, obviously, because it's a long-term strategy for the poverty alleviation and zero hunger and all of the SDGs. But the fact is that the results the comparative results in Costa Rica in education doesn't seem to improve enough. So that means that we have more resources mobilized for education, for example, but we don't have better results. So I think in this morning was another interesting mention that we need to improve the efficiency of the public expenditure, and this is, I think this is very important, also in connection with the future financial flows, because it's obviously the resource mobilization is important, the delivery is important also, but at the end of the time, what is more important is the impact, and we need to improve the methodologies or the frameworks for the impact assessment of our investments. In the case of Costa Rica, for example, we have a very broad portfolio of investment for environmental purposes. Many of them, probably the best opportunity would be to develop a transparent and credible impact framework, so we can attract more resources on the international community and impact investors all over the world, more than increasing the public expenditure. Well, this is not an option at this time for Costa Rica, also because we're running a 6% of GDP fiscal deficit, but again, probably the framework for impact assessment, or maybe it could be more important than the additional mobilizations, at least for the governments, because as I mentioned, over the last decades, the governments have increased the resource allocated, but not necessarily the results.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I had the temerity to ask Roy to speak for Latin America. I'm going to go even further in this respect and now pose this question to Neeti and say, Neeti, does the Global South need more finance or different finance or both? It works.
It's working? Okay, good. I can't speak on behalf of the Global South,
course,
but of course. But I tend to agree with what's already been said, that it matters where the money goes. It matters what sort of impacts we're having. It matters what sections of the population the finance is is reaching. And though I don't quite have answers for whether we need more finance or different finance, I would like to talk about untapped finance. Domestic resource mobilization is a central element of development policy, but it's highly neglected. If I just talk about my region, which is, developing Asia, we have some of the lowest average tax rates in the world. We're well below the European Union, the Americas, Africa, even the Middle East. And if I go further down into South Asia, which is where I come from, we are highly dependent on regressive indirect taxes that are levied on consumption. And if you see our personal income taxes, they account for only 2% of GDP, which is compared to 8% of GDP in developed countries. And the ability of our governments to raise revenue is further impacted by the workings of the shadow financial system or illicit financial flows, which result from activities like tax abuse by MNCs in the global elite, corruption, crime, trade misinvoicing, abusive transfer pricing, and the abuse of exploitation of loopholes in tax laws and international tax laws, which lead to developing countries conservatively losing between $1 to $1.6 trillion every year. The IFF definition, which is also included in the SDGs, it was included in the FFD, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, has been blocked, and now it's being hijacked with extremely technocratic bodies like the UNODC and UNCTAD being responsible for coming up with a methodology to decide the indicator. Illicit financial flows are currently a tier 3 indicator in the SDGs, which means that they do not necessarily have to be a priority for any government in the world. And then that brings me to the question of tax havens, which are countries or jurisdictions that offer financial secrecy and escape from tax and regulation of any kind. If you've at all heard about the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, or similar leaks before that, it'll point out the systemic way in which the rich and the powerful can avoid paying their fair share of taxes, and the inherent rot in our democracies that enable such things to happen. Tax havens are also able to attack the very foundations of our countries and our institutions. There are very different estimates that we find about the offshore economy, the magnitude of the offshore economy, which differ from $8.7 trillion held in tax havens to $32 trillion as part of the offshore economy. And though tax havens severely impact domestic resource mobilization, human rights, public spending, and they increase inequality, including gender inequality, there has been very little political action, political will that has been displayed to actually tackle this question. Very often we'll see intergovernmental bodies or a single country coming out with an extremely political list of tax havens, which will conveniently protect their friends and name very small jurisdictions on that list. But nobody really raises questions about this extremely coordinated network of tax havens that is mastered by the City of London, for example, or about onshore tax havens harbored by countries like the United States and Canada. I feel like there is a need to start getting political, to start addressing this issue with seriousness, and maybe, hopefully, tap into some of that untapped finance.
Okay, thank you very much. A very good point. I would just briefly recall attention to the point that Achim Steiner made earlier about the OECD UNDP program, Tax Inspectors Without Borders, which is a concrete way of getting at these issues. Arguably more should be done, but there are frameworks in place to take on these problems if there is indeed willingness to do so. Okay, you've heard from us up here on the stage. We have a few moments left before the session ends, so let's open up for comments and questions from you, from the audience, the other participants in our dialogue. What's your reaction? Do you have any questions that you would like to pose to any of our speakers? Please. Can you please raise your hand and identify yourself if you would like to speak? Okay. Yes, please. Limia, microphone here, please.
Limia Al-Taib, UNDP Albania, and thank you to all the panelists for very interesting comments and thought-raising, provocating messages. I have a question that I've been pondering on for a while. What is it that we can do to create the guarantees or incentives for risk-averse investors to actually put the money where it's needed? Because the investments are going to the easy places and not to the places where the UN framework, the SDGs, the conventions, or all of our values that we share here would drive them towards. So what are the guarantees or mechanisms that could sort of address that, even if partially, or even if theoretically at the beginning, to get a conversation going?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. Other questions, comments? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else from the floor, then let's now move to conclusion. And I would ask each of the panelists now to say a few words in terms of what your takeaways would be from the panel and from the dialogue so far, but also reflecting on the question that has just been posed. And if I may, Majlinda, I would like to ask you to be the first speaker with concluding remarks.
So the first takeaway that we'll be bringing back office, it's going to be a renewal dialogue with UNDP, so that from now on we have to identify those areas of common interest on which we could find the synergy and then trying to move hand in hand together. For the very first time now this year, since we are in the phase of closing up the new strategic working plan of the Regional Cooperation Council, we are kind of presenting some leeways for the new strategy Southeast Europe 2030, which is going to be in line with the new European strategy and SDGs as well. So I think that that is a takeaway, at least in principle, as a framework that is going to lead us to the next path. And secondly, as a takeaway, I wouldn't really see any change coming faster in the region than by trying to put more efforts in combining the innovation, education, employment, and being much more focused on skills. And if I could just partially answer to what Limia asked, what might be the guarantees? Well, and I'm speaking only on behalf of the Southeast Europe now and Western Balkans. I think rule of law in place might be the best guarantee for foreign investors. In terms of being sure that your money is put somewhere and that then is not going really to be lost, I think that investments as well should have the second phase of bringing values, not only money. And especially in high times when Western Balkans is not that it's having such, let's say, a high range of foreign direct investments. So it's only 1/3 of Germany, what the region is receiving in 1 year. But still, I think that that might be a very good and a very strong element. So whenever the money comes in, it has to be in line with those with the transformative process and the values that the region needs.
Okay, thank you very much. Robert, could I ask you for your reflections and 2 key takeaways from the session, and also, if you like, response to the question that Limia posed?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that can be done, first of all. And I think the coalition all behind common objectives are very, very key. I just want to come back on the taxation, the domestic resource mobilization. I mean, this is extremely key, of course. And again, the question is, I mean, yes, it's absolutely an option. The question again is how one does things. I think everybody's agreed on what needs to be done, but how? One very good example we had was working with WHO colleagues on cigarette taxes, smoking taxes, for example, and where you actually have a double benefit. So there's taxes and taxes. Of course, I mean, you just have to look at issues in Europe with petrol, fuel price rises, where, you've got to be very, very careful not to tax people who can't pay. And I think that's extremely important. One of the big issues across Asia is that energy tends to be quite problematic because the tariffs tend to be very low. And there's understandably, there's a lot of public concern if tariffs rise, that can I pay? Can I pay the electricity bill? Can I pay the kerosene bill? So you've got to be extremely careful. And I think, but again, the practical solution to this one is, sit down, work with governments, develop a proxy means testing system and a good ID system, so you know who needs to be supported. The social aspect, the social security system aspect, is extremely important to make sure that you're taxing the people who can pay. I think that's very important, and where there's also a public good. I think the cigarette example is a very good one. So it's a question of how you approach things. Just on the guarantees, one of the things that, I'm biased here, but one of the things that ADB's got, I think, the best record of any multilateral development bank is actually promoting investments in risky places. And we've got a remarkably good repayment record over 40, 50 years. And again, it comes down to very much the choice of whom are you working with, the companies. Are you on the same sort of ethical, ideological wavelength? Do they have a good product? One very recent example we've had is in Samoa, which doesn't get much private sector investment because it's very remote, the costs are pretty high. But we're funding their renewable energy development, quite large scale for Samoa. And there, ADB is providing lending to the particular company. We manage a trust fund for Canada, which then basically cuts the cost of finance for this particular company, and which makes it more affordable. So, and on top of it, we provide a political risk guarantee, so that if something does go wrong, the company just has the assurance that they will be backed up. There's any number of institutions which could do that. But making that all happen, again, the number of players involved, a company, Samoa, Canada, ADB, people around the sort of our boardroom, things can be made to happen for sure. But it does call for the managers of institutions who manage global finance to actually go out and tell their people, take risks. If you come up with a project in Samoa, let's say it goes wrong, don't worry, you'll be fine. Go out and take risks. So it comes down to those micro decisions, whether things will proceed or not. But there are ways, and I'll conclude on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Neeti, Biyani, how would you like to conclude this session?
I feel like there's a lot of good work being done, especially in terms of thinking about how we can work, but it's just maybe that we don't talk to each other enough. And I'm just thinking if, having some sort of mechanism under the FFD framework, because that is, a democratic platform that, has participation from practically every country on the planet, some sort of work stream which is co-chaired by member states, where we converge on crucial policy areas. If that is something that, we maybe need to think about in terms of how we can work together much more than we're working together and more efficiently. Also, I'm sort of torn between the question of, how much finance we can raise from, how much public finance we can raise vis-a-vis how much private finance we need. And while I don't think anyone has any ready answers, I feel this is also a question that we need to revisit within our countries. But while we do that, I feel like that needs to be matched with very optimistic multilateralism. And right now I see that there is a disassociation between what we agree to on global platforms and then what we go back and do within our own countries. So I feel that sort of, gap needs to be bridged. So I think these are my two key takeaways.
I think we're all in favor of bridging the gap of multilateralism. The question is how. Okay, Roy Gonzalez, the last word is yours.
Thank you. Well, I think it's very interesting, this topic of the finance in the SDGs. Of course, it has to do with taxes, and taxes are not very popular anywhere in Costa, but it works in Costa Rica, for example, thanks to the tax on fossil fuels. We implemented a payment for ecosystem services program back in decade, 15 years ago, and that allows us to recover the forest coverage of the country from 26%, only 26% back in the 80s, and now we have a 52.4, so it could work. Of course, it is necessary also to improve the effectiveness of the public expenditure, as I mentioned, and for that, I like a lot the presentation for the deputy ministers and the ministers regarding the public and public-private partnerships. The case for social impact bonds in Colombia, for example, is a very positive experience, and payment for results is also an alternative, interesting alternative to explore in order to get more results from the resources we already have. And for example, and finally, hopefully, if we can develop these impact frameworks that can show the investors the importance of the results that we're pretending to achieve with the the mobilized resources. We can do better things, more things over the future. And for tomorrow, I was looking at the agenda, and there's a couple of interesting presentations on the impact measurement or impact accountability, and I think that's also a very important for the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our hour, but more or less on time. So I would like to thank our panelists for sharing with us their insights and experience and wisdom from different perspectives, different parts of the world on these critical big picture questions, which will then go on and inform our thinking when we look at some of the more narrowly focused sectoral or thematic issues that are populating the program. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. And Ali Janbey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Not the floor. Actually, thank you very much, Ben, to you and to your panelists. Let's take a short coffee break now and come back here so we can start again and continue with the program at 4 p.m.